The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Not since the days of the now debunked Russian collusion scandal have we seen politicians in the media classes desperate to provide a specific spin and narrative on a story. Only this time, it's aimed at bringing down an investigation rather than lifting it up. Special counsel John Durham's investigation into Hillary Clinton's campaign and whether it sought to illegally bring down Donald Trump has become a lightning rod for political partisanship. But what's the truth? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're talking John Durham, his investigation, and cancel culture. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners in Arlington, Virginia, on WWRC 570 AM. Thanks for being part of the team. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. In what may turn out to be as big a scandal as Watergate itself, the Durham Report has all the potential to see heads roll, politically speaking. But what does it contain? And perhaps more importantly, how is it being rolled out? Well, we're thrilled to welcome back to the show a longtime host of this here Liberty Nation Radio and Liberty Nation senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for being here, Tim.
Like I say, Mark, always a pleasure.
So first, Tim, you've got to give me an outline of the latest findings. What do they suggest? What are the implications?
Well, John Durham, the special counsel who was appointed back in 2019, has alleged that the Clinton presidential campaign in 2016 paid a tech company to infiltrate the servers of Donald Trump at Trump Towers, his Central Park West apartment, and ultimately the White House after he was elected president in order, and this was specifically stated in the court filing, that it was for the purpose of finding derogatory information about him. Now, that may seem obvious, but when it's actually specifically included in the complaint or in the charge, in the filing, then it shows that the purpose was to smoke him out and try to get him first out of the campaign and then out of office by completely fabricating the Trump-Russia collusion scandal, for which more than one person won Pulitzer Prizes. Mark, think about that. Pulitzer Prizes for a complete hoax, and no chance that those Pulitzer Prizes get rescinded.
Now, are these findings credible, or are they, as the very few leftist media outlets that have even covered this story properly, just the fevered dreams of Trump supporters?
Well, it seems clear with, now that we're a few days removed from the initial court filing, that they couldn't completely ignore it. They tried to. On Sunday, which would have been the day to publish the finding, nothing. Crickets in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, virtually every major media outlet ignored a story which looked at objectively, neutrally, is at least as damaging as Watergate. Because now you have someone spying on, hacking, which is the equivalent of breaking into headquarters, isn't it? That's the 21st century equivalent of breaking into the
digital version,
headquarters. Yeah. And they've ignored it completely. Now, they finally realized that they had to do some coverage of it. The Washington Post ran a fact check saying that the Durham filing says much less than what Trump claims it says. The New York Times ran a news analysis on Monday that basically scolded right-wing outlets for promoting alarmist claims and dismissed coverage of the bombshell as mostly old news, nothing new, nothing to see here. And then you want to go to the far left, to the pretty much communist publication of Daily Kos, said Donald Trump is calling for the death penalty as John Durham shockingly charges no one with anything, which of course, that may be true to this point, but it sounds like the indictments are going to flow freely from here. So my question is, Mark, as a trained and seasoned journalist myself, I wonder how these journalists at the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere can sleep with themselves at night to ignore a story of the importance of Watergate, to act as if there's nothing there. How do they live with themselves? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's really quite disturbing how little coverage of it was happening. I mean, I did some research myself on that, and I got the list here of the sources I went to: ABC, CNN, LA Times, MSNBC, NBC, New York Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, USA Today, and of course Washington Post. And not a single one had a story on that by Monday afternoon. So this was 2 days. Well, the findings came out on Friday. And so they hadn't touched the story, and it was quite surprising that journalists have put so much ideology above what they're actually supposed to be doing. Now,
I mean, let's be honest, they have completely sacrificed their journalistic credibility. Now, they probably had completely sacrificed it at the altar of protecting Joe Biden from the Hunter Biden laptop story. So in that sense, they were already fully sold out. So this is just further proof, but it's utterly shameful, and it shows that we've come to the point where media is nothing but advocacy.
I think one of the most important aspects of this whole deal, Tim, is one that you outlined in a recent article on the page of libertynation.com, and that was the timing of the release. Would you care to fill us in on that?
As much as this is a bombshell allegation, as I put in my story on libertynation.com, the timing of it suggests that it's going to wind up being a lot less than it might be because of a simple fact that no other outlet seemed to be covering, which is that it was released on Super Bowl Saturday. Now, around Washington, it's conventional wisdom that if you have something that makes you look good, you release it early in the week, so you bask in the primetime glory of it all week. If you have bad news, you release it late on a Friday when no one's paying attention because they're looking forward to the weekend. This was even worse. It was released on Super Bowl Saturday when everybody's out buying stuff for their Super Bowl parties and paying attention to the biggest spectacle in American culture of the entire year. So the fact that Durham leveled a very serious charge here after 3 years of investigation, but released it on Super Bowl weekend suggests that this man, who for 45 years has been a government prosecutor, want to make sure that he does his job, but he wants to make sure that he doesn't make a spectacle of himself and release it at a time where the media might be forced to cover it during the weekdays when people are particularly paying attention. So Durham wants to release the facts, but he doesn't want to go too far and embarrass his fellow members of the deep state. Now, the other thing is, Mark, is a little more obvious. Durham's been at this for 3 years. It took 1,000 days to come up with this revelation. I'm sorry, with the full weight of the government and the Justice Department at your avail, how does it take you 1,000 days or 15 months past the last election in question to release something that now has very little significance, except to the extent that Barack Obama and his vice president and current president, Joe Biden, may or may not have had anything to do with this whole thing? Because, of course, we know they were all tied together during the Clinton campaign, trying to make sure Donald Trump never got elected. So I think the next question, though, you're going to get is they'll start questioning the credibility of John Durham, even though he had been employed by the Obama administration as a special counsel. as an earlier investigation in 2010. So they have a few more cards to play. But the timing of this suggests that Durham doesn't want to make a federal case out of it.
Now, with that stuff in mind, I know a lot of people have hopes for an ultimate truth here that will be revealed at some point in the future. But how do you see it playing out? Will it be like the Mueller report, which was, for many people, is more a Rorschach test, in which case you could take out of it what you wanted to take out or see what you wanted to see?
Mark, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? If this is a scandal of Watergate proportions, but elite media institutes a complete blackout on the story, will it have any impact on 2022 and 2024? That's the open question. It's up to the voters. Because ironically, Mark, in an age where we have more information available than ever, right at our fingertips, on demand, 24/7, 365, people are more than capable of informing themselves about critical issues and stories. And yet, in the 2020 campaign, in a survey that was done afterwards of swing state voters by the Media Research Center, 50% of voters said they did not know anything about the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, which turned out to be completely true, not denied at all. 50% didn't even know. And when asked if it would have changed their votes when presented with the facts, the proven facts of the situation, it would have reversed the outcome of the election. The media succeeded in burying a story that might have beaten their guy. So if they did it then, they're certainly going to do it now, because on reflection, Hillary Clinton's crimes could damage Joe Biden, no question. And of course, their job now is not to be journalists, it's to protect the left.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
Later in the show, we examine the legal specifics of the Durham investigation. But up next, why is the media keen to bury the whole story?
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Long gone are the days when scandal plays itself out behind closed doors. Now, each utterance and factoid is debated in the public sphere to fill the ever-hungry 24-hour news cycle. But not the findings of John Durham, it seems. The legacy media has decided this is all information non grata. How and why are the questions to be answered? And to help us with that, we're joined by author and podcaster, Mr. Jeff Charles. Welcome back to the show, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So, Jeff, the latest Durham findings, for many people, they're somewhat shocking, to say the least, assuming that they are what they represent to be. And yet we've heard little from the left-leaning media other than efforts to poo-poo the entire investigation. What's your take on this?
Wait, you mean they found out that they were spying on the Trump administration while Trump was in office and the media isn't talking about it? I'm shocked. I can't believe that. No, here's what's going on here, Mark. Of course they're not talking about this because they don't want the American public to know about it. Trump was right. Everybody else was right. The whole thing was a scam from the beginning. And what got me about this is that they weren't trying to actually find a tie to Russia and Trump. They were trying to look for whatever they could to concoct one. So, yeah, of course, the activist media isn't going to cover this, at least not yet. I mean, eventually, I think it's going to get to the point where they have to. But right now, mum's the word.
Okay, now, I'm old enough to remember when Robert Mueller's investigation was the most important event in the whole history of mankind, at least according to the Fourth Estate. So why is this investigation different? I mean, we know that the Steele dossier that began the entire Russiagate affair and narrative, it was a fake. This is not even in dispute anymore, I guess. So why try to hide the origins of it?
Yeah, the reason this investigation is different, Mark, is because it doesn't promote their political agenda. See, the reason they don't want the American public to know about this is because, yeah, the American public already know by now, pretty much everybody knows the Steele dossier was fake, that Robert Mueller's $32 million investigation was basically based on a hoax, but they don't know how egregious it was. They don't know the extent to which the Clinton campaign and the Democrats and these operatives were going to try to cook up this narrative about Trump in Russia. Like, this is if Durham's allegations are true, this is a huge bombshell that shouldn't be ignored, but they're going to ignore it because they don't want all of us to know how bad this actually was.
Yeah, for those of us who watch these media shenanigans quite closely, I think this path of poo-pooing the reports and the information that's coming out rather than reporting on it, it was almost expected, wasn't it? I mean, this is what we knew would happen, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, once Biden stepped foot in the Oval Office, the activist media went from being an attack dog against the Trump administration to becoming the Democrats' ministry of propaganda. So why would they report on this? I mean, the mask is off, Mark. I mean, these people are activists, and they are actively working to promote the Biden administration and to try to drag him to success by hook or by crook. So, yeah, if that's their role, if that's how they see their role, which I believe they do, why would they even touch the story unless they can find a way to spin it?
Yeah, I'm seeing that Fox News is coming out like a dog on a bone with this story, and it's one of the few major outlets that really are. Now, you and I, if we get our news from a range of sources, as we must, we're journalists, we have to get balance, we have to get proper coverage, and we have to see what each side of the equation is saying. But are you surprised at how distinct the battle lines between the left and the right are on this? Specifically, I think because the Durham investigation was covered by the media before. And you mentioned the Mueller investigation that cost millions upon millions. And until this very latest notion on John Durham, the last story, for example, on CNN was back in September, and it was saying this investigation has cost $3.8 million, which is, of course, a drop in the ocean of how much these things technically cost. So why the division? Because you'd expect them to report at least something on it, wouldn't you?
No, and I think they will, Mark. I think right now they're just kind of waiting to see what might come out of this. I think they're also trying to figure out how to spin it. But you're right. I mean, I looked on CNN, New York Times, MSNBC, all of the big players, and there was nothing. There was nothing but crickets. When I looked up Durham, they showed me a picture of a cricket on these sites because they're not touching this. So I think that they're trying to be silent right now. Maybe they're hoping that it'll go away, that it'll blow over. But they do not want to report on this honestly, and there's a reason why.
So final question for you, Jeff. What would it take for them to actually begin covering the story? You mentioned that obviously they might be looking for a certain angle of narrative to run, or they're waiting for further developments. But what would bring this story out into the open on sites all across the spectrum?
I would say one of two things, or maybe even both. One, information comes out that allows them to spin the story in a way that obfuscates what actually happened, so that the public doesn't actually see how serious this was. If there's something that they can use to spin it, then they'll start to cover it, but they'll start to cover it in a way that is skewed in their favor. Two, it could be that some other information comes out that makes that even shows us even that the situation was even worse. And at a certain point, they're not going to be able to ignore it because it's going to be out there so much with other types of media, like you mentioned, Fox News and others. So at some point, they are going to cover it. It's just a matter of which happens first, I believe.
Jeff Charles, thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sundays on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM. Coming down the pipeline, we're looking at just what crimes have and have not been committed as far as the Durham investigation says. But up next, what happens when the left cancels itself?
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Sometimes the baying mobs have a tendency to turn around and bite those that have been urging them on. And these last weeks provided ample examples of the left cancelling itself, from Whoopi Goldberg to Jeff Zucker. It seems that those who live by the sword are likely to suffer a fate at the same implement. Well, nobody's been following this grand eating of its own closer than Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent and in-house satirist, Graham J. Noble. Welcome to the show, Graham.
Thanks, Mark. Good to be here.
So what I want to know, Graham, is these folks who get themselves cancelled on the extreme left, surely they must have seen that the dragon they helped create would come back and burn them, mustn't they?
Well, one would have thought so, perhaps. But then again, I think there's a certain amount of hubris at play here. And the folks that really kind of started and promoted this whole cancel culture thing, they realize that they have some very powerful institutions on their side. I mean, they basically have the world of academia, they have the larger part of the entertainment industry, the larger part of the media.
The government.
And now the government as well, yes, and also the larger section of corporate America. And so I believe that with that kind of weight of power and influence behind them, I think they probably for a while considered themselves immune to becoming victims themselves of cancel culture.
Yeah, it seems that there's almost a lack of responsibility in this particular faction of the left. They conjure up grand dreams of revolution and remaking a nation on the ashes of the last one that came before. And then they gasp in horror when things go so badly wrong. Now, I've got a great example here, the Black Lives Matter protest. Now, I can see why folks would want to protest any unjust killing by the police. But then we should all be angry about that. But then the riots came, the burnings, the lootings, the attacks, and even the murders, because there were murders. And the folks who pushed it all, they look on it and they wonder, how did it all go wrong? What's the mindset here that explains the reaction?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play here. And I think the first thing is that those people who really have made cancel culture a major aspect of American culture these days, they are zealots, really. They're fanatic. And of course, the main characteristic of zealotry or fanaticism is a very narrow-minded kind of a single-mindedness, if you like. And that single-mindedness leads one to disregard the potential for unintended consequences. It's the end justifies the means attitude. And so the end goal is what they're in pursuit of, and any collateral damage that is caused, even possibly to themselves, is not a consideration. Of course, I will say one thing about the Black Lives Matter movement, since you brought that particular organization up. We shouldn't forget that they are primarily driven by promoting a Marxist agenda. And the idea that they're actually concerned with protecting Black people is nonsense. And that fact is proven, of course, by this defund the police campaign that they began. And of course, defunding the police most negatively affects those Blacks who live in crime and drug-ridden inner city neighborhoods. So, Black Lives Matter has never... Yeah. Black Lives Matter has never concerned themselves first and foremost with the welfare of Black people.
Absolutely. You have some of the co-founders there, Patrisse Cullors, for example, and in their manifesto, they write about how they want to destroy the idea of the nuclear family, which, as we know, has been one of the drivers of not having a nuclear family has been one of the drivers of poverty and crime in recent years. And of course, all these funds that have come in and they end up buying mansions in Canada, as we've seen in recent days. You hit the nail on the head. It's from a Marxist standpoint, and anything that doesn't go along with the Marxist standpoint must fall before it. Now, during these recent calls for cancellation that we've heard, it's notable that the White House is actually getting itself involved, especially with regards to Joe Rogan, the podcaster. Now, they don't mention him by name so much, but to have the government siding with censors or self-appointed censors, it seems a step too far. Now, it's not Joe Biden's role to demand that free speech be curtailed. It's his job to protect everybody's right to use it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's one of the first and foremost responsibilities of a United States president is to is to protect and defend the Constitution. And what goes along with that is protecting and defending everybody's constitutional rights, including their First Amendment rights. So it's really outrageous that the White House has directly inserted itself into this battle to censor one set of views and opinions, and even ones that not just views and opinions, but in some cases actual facts, actual verifiable facts that they just don't happen to find convenient. And so that's a dark road that we're going down when literally elected officials, particularly the commander-in-chief, is getting involved in these kind of ideological disputes. That's definitely not his place.
So is there a tipping point on the horizon, Graham? A moment when people say they've had enough, people of all political stripes, and they say, this has gone too far. Do you see that happening?
Actually, to be quite honest with you, Mark, I actually believe it's already happening. I believe that we've passed the tipping point, because I honestly believe that the vast majority of Americans, whether they vote Republican or Democrat, I've had it up to here with cancel culture, and they see the damage that it is doing to everything. And I believe that most aren't going along with it. The people that are still pushing it are the extremists, are these left-wing, I come back to using the word zealots. That's what they are. They're basically conducting like a scorched earth campaign against anybody who doesn't agree with them, regardless of the consequences. But I would point out this, and that is that, of course, a lot of people and organizations on the left are themselves becoming victims of cancel culture in a way that they didn't intend. Ironically, since cancel culture is pushed by the extreme left, what is ultimately going to kill it is free market economics. And we're already seeing that. I mean, CNN, MSNBC, their ratings have been in the gutter for some time now, and that's because of what they do. That they've given up journalism in favor of being propagandists. But also, if you look at recently, this thing with the Canadian truckers, great example. GoFundMe, which is a crowdfunding website. It was being used to raise money to support these truckers. Now, GoFundMe has in the past deplatformed certain movements, certain organizations, certain campaigns with which it did not agree. And it did the same thing to the Canadian truckers, got itself in an awful lot of problems. It's now going to be investigated by possibly multiple states. And not only that, but look at it this way, Mark. GoFundMe had almost become a household name. Most people have heard of GoFundMe, even if they don't use it, even if they've never been to the site, they're familiar with what GoFundMe is. They're familiar with the company. But how many Americans up until very recently had heard of a crowdfunding site called Give, Send, Go? So this is one of the unintended consequences of cancel culture, is that GoFundMe have managed to make a competitor famous, and they themselves are now in trouble. And a lot of people on the right are going to indulge in some cancel culture and walk away from using GoFundMe, and they're going to go to Give, Send, Go, which is now actually hosting crowdfunding in support of the Canadian truckers. And it's like the rise of Rumble as a competitor to YouTube, the rise of Gab and Parler as competitors to Facebook and Twitter. So yeah, it's all. I believe we've already reached the tipping point, and for the cancel culture fanatics, I think it's all down here from now on.
Graham J. Noble, thank you ever so much.
You're welcome, Mark. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere. After this short break, we tackle the legal loopholes of the Durham investigation. Don't touch that dial.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
With the Durham findings becoming a political football and each side keen to either bolster or destroy the investigation before it's even done, what's most missing is the legal analysis of what has been found to date. So what crimes have actually been committed? What are the ramifications of such? And will there ever actually be a trial? To find out these answers, we're once again talking liberty with the host of the excellent Uprising podcast and Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being back on the show, Scott.
Always a pleasure, Mark. Cheers.
Okay, Scott, I guess the first question has to be, what are the allegations or suggestions made by John Durham's recent filings, and are they indicative of actual crimes?
To the second question, I will say that they lend themselves to the crime of lying to the FBI chiefly, and perhaps other crimes depending on who had legal access to the data in question. So as I understand it, and it is a little convoluted, is that a computer company had access to certain data. They had legal access to that data because they were servicing their customers, and that's how they got access to the data, DNS or domain name server data. And then they used their access to that data to provide it or help Hillary Clinton's campaign, in any case, craft a narrative by sort of selling it. And I don't mean that in a literal sense, but I mean offering it to federal agencies, namely the FBI and the CIA, to then hopefully get them to instigate an investigation about what that data suggested. I hope that was
Were they within their rights to offer that data? Because presumably they were employed to do work for the clients. Now, here we're talking, there was the Trump campaign, and of course, there's also talk of it being the White House Executive Office, which is the President Trump's information. Now, surely...
Well, let's just stop the tape right there and talk about that second part about whether or not this concerned behavior or data that was gathered while Mr. Trump was president of the United States. The very latest court filings suggest that that is not the case, that all of the discussion about the data and the data provided was about candidate Trump and not President Trump. That's according to the latest filings made in response to the Durham filing.
So were those who are providing DNS services legally allowed to sell that data onwards or to provide that data to third parties, as far as we know?
Okay, well, that's where things get interesting. So presumably a contract with one party would have confidentiality provisions included in it, but it would have to be the party that they had the contract with that would have to assert it. So if you contract with a entity to provide you internet service, and you're a political campaign, it's up to you to assert your privilege over the confidentiality of that information, not just some member of the public. But I will say this, for any company that has data that they believe suggests that there may be, that they may actually have honestly believe that there is some treason or other federal or state crime involved, it's up to them to actually go ahead and say, blow the whistle and say, hey, listen, FBI, whoever, we believe we may see evidence of a crime here. That's appropriate. And that wouldn't violate a confidentiality clause. In fact, you couldn't have a confidentiality clause that included protection from evidence of a crime. So that part isn't about it. But with the Hillary Clinton campaign, it stands to reason that if you have access to this data in one avenue in which it's legal for you to have access to this data, and then you use it for your own means and methods over on the other side of the coin, right? That is likely violative of at least presumably your contract with who you had the data with originally, if not some other federal or state law that governs trade secrets and things like that.
So let me just clarify that then. So the latest findings suggest that people hired by the Clinton campaign hired others or operated with others to craft a narrative based on either illegally or legally obtained electronic info, which then got shopped around to government agencies in the hopes of starting a Russian collusion investigation. Do I have that about right?
I think so, yes. It's a bit tough to keep track of for myself. But so we have this lawyer, Mr. Sussman. He's the one who's been currently charged with the federal crime of lying to the FBI. And what it appears is that he had access through another client of his to this data. And what he did was, and apparently this is uncontroverted as far as I've seen, is he lied about that he was in fact representing a client, that he and perhaps this other person went to the FBI and said, hey, look, we discovered this stuff and here you go, when in fact he was being paid to go to the FBI to say, hey, get the ball rolling on this kind of investigation.
I noticed that when the left-leaning media outlets actually do cover this story on the rare occasions they do so, the writers are attempting to play down what's happening to a certain degree. Now, they may be right to do so, but is it fair to say that the same treatment or leniency wasn't given to the Mueller investigation?
I think it was, if it wasn't Glenn Reynolds at Instapundit, it was somebody who he quotes often, which is to say that the correct way to think about these big box media types is that they're simply Democrat Party operatives with bylines. And so all the coverage is going to skew in one direction when they're writing it. That absolutely is true.
Okay, now it's been over 1,000 days since the investigation began. And is there a deadline in sight? And I think more importantly, is there some kind of statute of limitations issue here?
Just 2 weeks to stop the spread, Mark. That's all. That's all we need, right? Well, there are statute of limitations concerns. I think that, for instance, Mr. Sussman, he cannot be charged with some of the newer allegations, I believe, because there's a 5-year, it seems, statute of limitations for instance, lying to the FBI. There may be other crimes that can be uncovered where that statute may not apply, and knowledge of the crime, if a crime goes undiscovered and then it's discovered, that's when the statute starts, basically, right? So there are complications that could exist there. I would say that those charges, though, we better start seeing some soon if they're going to be made, I think. On the flip side of that coin, it seems like when the federal government wants to go after somebody, there are enough avenues for them to go after them that I wouldn't want to be on the other side of that coin where my only defense to a crime was the statute of limitations. But there are, God, I'm sorry.
I think it's interesting that a lot of these media outlets that we're talking about, they're very much downplaying that, as you say, it's uncontested, that Mr. Sussman lied to the FBI. And they're saying that this is not a big deal. And yet I remember quite clearly, I'm old enough to remember General Flynn being prosecuted for the same thing and then being dragged through the papers for, well, it's going on for 4 years or so, I believe.
It went on for a very long time until he got his pardon, right? Or a commutation. Yeah.
So this brings us back to the question again. Certain crimes, when committed by one person, when compared to committed by another, it all depends on party alliance, it seems.
Well, not only that, but prosecutorial discretion. This lying to the FBI business, while I think it's abhorrent when it's designed by an officer of the court to sick the FBI on an American to create a narrative, that's one type of lying. But the other type of lying is just, where were you on Tuesday? And you don't want to say where you really were, so you lie and you say you were somewhere else, and that kind of lie gets prosecuted. And those lies, for those of us who treasure free speech, we often say that it should be permissible to lie to the FBI, at least for that kind of thing. It gets a bit tricky when you're an officer of the court and you're trying to lie to sick them on, some innocent third party. But straight lying, and sort of the Martha Stewart example, is the one that really I talk about most often. The idea that should be a federal crime, I think, is, it's not supported by the First Amendment.
Okay. Any final thoughts on this that folks should be considering, Scott?
I would just suggest that no matter where Barack Hussein Obama or Hillary Clinton go, that they be confronted with the question of what did they know and when did they know it regarding Mr. Sussman's claims to the FBI on their behalf against Donald Trump.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
That's just about it for this edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I want to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Jeff Charles, Graham J. Noble, and Scott D. Cosenza for joining us. And of course, my warmest thanks to you, the listeners, for coming along for the ride. A final thought before we close out. The idea of a political party or a media establishment crafting a narrative seems in modern times quite innocuous. We literally see it every day and dismiss it as basic politicking. But it's so much more than that. Narratives are the stories and even history of our culture. When a narrative becomes dominant, we lose the truth, the actual facts from the societal record. Don't accept narrative as just simple spin. It's a theft that robs us, first of the past and ultimately of the future. And that might be the worst crime of all.